Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. Alan Miller here, and we have one of our favorite political guests and favorite guests other than that, non-political, but you recognize him instantly, our favorite prognosticator of elections, hopefully with good news today, Professor David Schultz. And you've also been a guest host on the program as well as a guest.
Correct.
What we want to hear from you today is how much will Hillary win by, or do we have to start looking for real estate in Panama?
Okay. Not sure we have to go as far as Panama, but let's just say, as of right now, the election is down to a cluster of swing voters in a few swing counties in a few swing states.
Now, you have a book, the name of which is Presidential Swing States, Why Only 10 Matter.
Correct, yeah. And what's really interesting is, even though people want to talk about this being an unusual election, and there are many reasons why it is, at the end of the day, it's still normal in the sense that we're seeing the candidates in these last few days campaigning in just a small cluster of states. They're in Ohio, they're in Florida, they're in North Carolina, Wisconsin, a few other states. And so what we're seeing is the election really hang upon what's going to happen in these very few states.
Virginia,
New Hampshire, and so forth like that. And I think right now, actually, let's take us back about 7 to 8 days ago. Let's take us back to right before the FBI Director Comey's announcement or letter to Congress.
Non-announcement
is a better way of describing it. And it looked like Clinton was pulling away. You know, that before the first presidential debate, it looked pretty close, but for about 3 weeks there, Clinton was pulling away and looked like she was going to cruise to a pretty solid victory, along with Democrats doing well in the Senate, picking up quite a few seats in the House. Comey's non-announcement really sort of has started to reverse things. Clinton was starting to be was going down in the polls a little bit before that, but now bring us to this last weekend of the election, and national polls have them tied. But as I always tell people, never pay attention to national polls, because as we learned with Al Gore in 2000, it's not the popular vote, it's the Electoral College. Clinton still seems to have enough of a lead in enough states.
In the states. It's the states that make the difference.
Exactly.
So if you can be tied in the country, but you're ahead in the key states, you will win the election.
Correct. And right now she still is ahead. She still has enough of her core base states that are going to go Democratic, and she's still leading in enough states at this point, swing states, that she's over 270 electoral votes that she should win. The real issue now is in those swing states, what's the turnout going to be like? And that's the real battle between now and Election Day, making sure for Clinton that she gets her base out to vote.
She has a ground game.
Right.
She has a team that's working in each of these states. The Trump people do not. They're taking full-page advertisements in papers, but they don't have the ground game that the Democrats have. Do you think that'll make a difference?
That should make the difference, all things being equal. At the end of the day, it is, as Woody Allen said, 90% in this case, 100% of life is showing up. Is that if she can get her people out in sufficient numbers, she should win the election. There's some indications that with the early voting, she's been relatively successful of being able to mobilize her supporters. But really, it is this critical last weekend, because we're probably still looking at about 5% of the population that's undecided.
That's beyond my comprehension at this point.
Right, and where I say undecided, it's a combination of two things. Undecided, either who they're going to vote for, or are they even going to vote? And that's really what we're looking at this point, is that there are many people who don't particularly like either of the candidates and have not decided yet if they're going to turn out to vote. And so this is the weekend to seal the deal, so to speak, to be able to win the election. And again, right now, as of Friday, Clinton still has a lead, but there are some indications in the polls that some of that support that she needs in those swing states is continuing to erode.
And I saw something in the New York Times today. They said there are still 4 shoes that can drop. Number one, there was talk of a terrorist attack in New York City.
Right.
Number 2, are the Russians going to get involved even further through WikiLeaks? And is there some kind of material that's going to be dumped?
Right.
Number 3, of course, we have the antipathy of people toward Clinton,
right,
as well as Trump.
Right.
And I'm trying to think what the other one was, but there were reasons why the thing is not a lock. I can't understand it, because to me it should be a lock. I think Trump has had 15 months in which to lose the respect of everybody, right, in this country. Can you explain why people are gravitating toward him?
Well, I think there's a few different things. One of them, I think, is really the sense of economic frustration in the world. I mean, yes, I think there's a certain amount of sexism out there that's hurting Clinton. In fact, I've argued that it's actually been a quiz question I've asked this year. What percentage of the electorate do you think won't vote for a woman just because she's a woman, regardless if it's a Clinton or Jane Doe? I still think it's about 30%, but I don't know what the right answer is. You've got some sexism there. You've got some anti-Clintonism out there. You have some racism that's clearly driving some of the Trump people. But what you also have going on out here is something that also drove Bernie Sanders, is that we know that we have the greatest levels of economic inequality in this country since the 1920s. So, the average American family now is making less than it was 25 or 30 years ago. And Trump is speaking to this economic frustration out there. I don't think he has any solutions to it. But there's
also, we know that he speaks truthfully about 4% of the time.
That's right.
And if you think, or anybody thinks, that Trump is going to help the middle class,
He's not. But my point is that there's this incredible economic frustration, and a frustration that's directed at Washington and the establishment in Washington. And Clinton, in many ways, is the face of the establishment. And so I think there's no one multiple reason, but others, several of them. But we also have to be honest here, I would say, is that Clinton has hurt herself in some situations. And what has struck me really interesting in this election is clearly neither of the candidates are making the positive case for why they should be elected. And going into this last weekend, normally candidates sort of make the closing argument and say, vote for me because.
It's like the summation
the
to
summation,
a trial.
Exactly. And I'm waiting to see for Clinton to do that, to give people the argument to why to vote for her, and as opposed to voting against Trump. And I think there's been some campaign mistakes that Clinton has made, which have also contributed to why this race is so close, even though it shouldn't be.
A year ago, Christmas, I wrote a column in which I was supporting Bernie Sanders at the time, talked about the Clinton arrogance in which they go at their own way and don't listen to people. Of course, Trump is the same way,
Sure.
But to a much greater degree. I mean, who would have thought that it would be this close between these two people, this woman who has 30 years of experience, including being a U.S. Senator, including being the Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of
State, excuse me, and is known throughout the world, and nervous countries around the world. Now, we've had 8 days in which markets have dropped.
Yes.
Because they're nervous about what happens if Trump becomes president, to say nothing of individuals like myself who have the same nervousness, especially when I see some of the people who surround him and who he relies on, be it David Duke of the KKK, who yesterday said it's not all Jews that he doesn't like, it's just most Jews.
That's right.
And things like that, and yet people gravitate toward him.
Yeah.
How could any minority gravitate toward him? How could a Hispanic,
How could a
black, a woman?
That's right.
I mean, he's such a misogynist. And he bragged about it.
Yeah.
And yet people move in his direction. I can't understand it.
Yeah. I mean, what I like to point out to people is that there's sort of two sides to America. The United States. There's this really wonderful side of our country, but there's this ugly side in America that starts back in 1689 when we burned a bunch of women at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts, claiming they were witches. And I say that because fear and prejudice gets us to do a lot of really nasty things. Richard Hofstadter, a famous American historian, talked once about both the anti-intellectualism and the paranoid style of American politics. Trump is tapping into that ugly side, that fear, that sense of some people feeling like, well, the reason why things aren't going well, it's because those people are the fault. Well, you know what that sounds like to me? Kind of sounds like Hitler when he used to talk about in the 20s and 30s and say, it's those people who are the cause of all the problems. And so there are these parallels in terms of language, of looking for the scapegoat. And Trump is labeling Clinton, labeling Washington, labeling lots of people immigrants, Mexicans, the Chinese, Muslims, all as the scapegoats.
And we've seen in just this last week a really upswing in anti-Semitism, which I thought, we were moving away from. The burning of a Muslim mosque with a Vote Trump sign. Some really problems for blacks in a number of states where people are trying to keep them, Republicans are trying to keep them from exercising the franchise for having a vote. A bunch of cases I think will be decided today as we sit here in that regard in some of the states. And then the question is, will it be in time? To say nothing of who do you want to pick your next Supreme Court justice, assuming that the Senate allows you to get to the point of picking a Supreme Court justice. And then come back to the FBI. What did Comey do last week? I mean, what was the motivation behind that non-letter?
It's there's almost nothing that Comey is going to find with the materials on Huma Abedin, Clinton's assistant's computer, that's going to speak to anything remotely about any criminal intent or by Clinton. And I mention this because clearly Clinton was sloppy about handling emails. We will all concede it wasn't the smartest thing in the world to do.
Notwithstanding the fact that some of her predecessors did the exact same thing, Colin Powell jumps to mind immediately.
Right. But the point I get at here is that when Trump and others say, lock her up or she's a criminal, I have to point out that as far as I know in this country, in order to convict somebody of a crime, not only do you have to prove they did something, but they have to have the requisite mental intent. And if you look at the statutes that she's potentially could be charged with, they say things like knowingly and recklessly doing something, or one of the statutes is one of the old espionage acts that was in place from World War I or World War II. You have to show that you intentionally wanted to bring harm to the United States. Now, Clinton may be a lot of things. She's no traitor. You can't say that she really wanted to hurt the United States. So the point is she didn't do anything criminal, and there's nothing you're going to find on any of these emails that are going to speak to her criminal intent. And so that non-announcement by the FBI director really came at a point where it unfortunately and ill-advisedly looked like it was trying to influence the election.
In my mind, I've concluded that it couldn't have had any other thought. He had to at that point. And of course, we see today that one of Clinton's advisors in 2015 suggested that he was not a fit person to head the FBI. And you wonder, is that coming home to roost in his letter last Friday?
Yeah.
That's just the latest WikiLeaks dump today.
Yeah.
The fact that WikiLeaks is even dumping stuff that we don't absolutely, we can't vouch for its integrity.
Right.
That WikiLeaks, that Julian Assange is affecting our election. This multiple accused rapist who fled into the Ecuadorian embassy in England so that he wouldn't have to face the music in Sweden and be legitimately tried.
Right.
It is beyond me, and it's really depressing and really obsessing about it.
Well, it's really sad where the election really hinges upon issues such as her emails. Remember back during the Democratic primary at one point where in one of the debates where Bernie Sanders said, "I don't give a damn about your emails." We really needed to get beyond those. Again, there's nothing criminal there that I can see. I speak of that as somebody who's taught criminal justice as a law professor. It's conceitedly Clinton never got ahead of this issue, but at some point it would actually have been nice to have a campaign where we talked about real issues, where we talked about the pressing issues of globalization, of the gap between rich and poor, the high cost of tuition,
global warming. These things that were not even touched.
Yeah,
probably the biggest threat to this Earth.
Exactly.
That's out there.
Right. And what it's really turned into is a campaign where essentially the two candidates are running on the slogan of "I'm not the other guy." Whoever gets elected come election day will probably have no mandate, because neither of them will have talked much about the issues, about their vision of what they want to accomplish. On top of which, assuming Clinton gets elected, she walks immediately into a House of Representatives, which is more than likely to stay Republican, which is not going to cooperate. And even if the Democrats take back the Senate, they're not going to have 60 votes. They're not going to be able to break a filibuster. We're almost guaranteeing she walks into the exact same problems that Barack Obama is confronting right now in terms of the inability to move an agenda through the House of Representatives and Congress.
So how do you see the 10 key states?
How I see them at this point is that they're very close. At this point, we have, well, first off, I'll say Ohio and Florida right now seem to be slightly leaning Trump. He has to win those. In fact, Trump has to win every state Mitt Romney won in 2012, plus he's got to win Florida, he's got to win Ohio, probably has to pick up Pennsylvania and be able to win this election. And so he has a lot he has to fight for at this point. Pennsylvania is still at this late date about a 7-point lead for Clinton. North Carolina, which is a state that Romney won back in 2012, is still slightly leaning Clinton. In fact, if I were giving any kind of a prediction, North Carolina closes at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on election night. If Clinton wins North Carolina, the election is over. We can all go to bed early that night. And so, in some sense, North Carolina is the key this year to the election. Clinton wins it, it's over. If Clinton loses it, it means Trump has a chance, but he still has to win a lot of other states that are going to be very difficult for him to pull off.
Now, another thing that we don't know, we have a lot of people who have said they're undecided, and we have a lot, and I put no stock in these polls for the reasons that we've already discussed, but we have people who may say they're voting one way or the other because they're afraid to say how they're really going to vote when they get in the voting booth. Now, we don't know if those people are Trump people who say that they're going to vote for Trump, but they really can't fathom voting for Trump. They can't really imagine what it would do to the country. But then we also have the same thing with Clinton. They say they're voting for Clinton, but when they get in there, they might say, oh, what the hell? Let's give this guy a chance. He's not one of the corrupt Washingtonians.
Right, and I want to do a parallel. Take us back to 1980. This was Jimmy Carter, who was the incumbent, versus Ronald Reagan, the challenger. And I mention this because going into the Friday before the election, Carter and Reagan are pretty close, very tight race. And what happened in about the last 72 to 96 hours, several million people made up their minds, these undecided voters, and they decided to sort of throw caution to the wind and broke against Carter and voted for Reagan. And one of the things that I'm curious about here, are we going to see something parallel, that for those undecided voters who don't like the status quo, who are not happy with Washington, will they say at the last minute, what the heck, I'm going to vote against the status quo, that is Clinton, and just take a chance with this guy Trump? And I can see scenarios where that might happen.
That is really, the man has had 15 months in which he's campaigned, in which to establish himself as a champion of the people. Instead, he has gone above and beyond anything conceivable to alienate large groups of people, to prove his lack of fitness. Do we want his finger, and I hope a lot of people think of that, on the nuclear button? Because number one, he's not a student, he doesn't read, he has no patience. I think probably somebody said he had ADD. It could very well be an attention deficit disorder. So narcissistic and wrapped into himself that he doesn't listen to anybody else. He knows more than the generals. Well, look what's happening in Iraq today, because our generals have really come up with a plan that is defeating ISIS, at least in Iraq.
Right.
But it's so worrisome because we don't know. We don't know what's in the heads of these people who haven't voted yet.
Yeah, we don't. And that is sort of the $64,000 question. What's in their head? And moreover, I think the other $64,000 question is looking at what turnout's going to be. We can't really infer total turnout by early voting. Early voting is not a good indicator of what the total turnout is going to be.
Especially this year, it's so different, early voting this year.
Exactly,
right.
Yeah. The laws have changed so much that, a lot of people might be convenience voting, and that's okay. And I can see a couple of possible scenarios. One is that the public so dislikes the candidates. The Trump people come out in droves because they hate Clinton. The Clinton people come out because they hate Trump. Huge turnout. Second scenario is a lot of people decide to say, I don't particularly like either of the candidates. I'm going to stay home on election day. And all the experts that I consult and talk to about this are as perplexed as I am, not knowing really what's going to happen in terms of what's going to drive turnout on November 8th. And I think that's critical because Clinton has to get people of color, has to get young people, has to get women out in very large numbers to support her, for her to be able to win.
Hispanics, Latinos.
People of color, exactly, correct, exactly.
Yes, and I listen to a lot of pundits on television. You listen to MSNBC and you think, oh, she's home free.
Yeah.
Then I flip over to Fox.
Right.
And I said, oh, it's going to be a disaster. He's going to win.
Yeah.
And the question is, we don't really know. None of us really know, which is why we rely on experts like you who says, I don't know either.
Yeah, and I don't. I mean, I have some intuitions, but I have nothing firm at this point. I mean, again, the most firm I can be is again, as of the time we're taping this, she still seems to have those lead in the critical swing states. But we still have, approximately 72, 96 hours to go. I think just as equally as important is what's happening in critical Senate races across the country. Will the Democrats be able to take back the Senate, which would be important for confirmation hearings? It would be important for also, let's say, ambassadorial and other things. And so I think that's one of the other things we should be looking at. And we also shouldn't forget that this is an election with lots of governorships and state legislators around the country up for election, including in the state of Minnesota.
Although I will say that I have more confidence in the intellect of the Minnesota voters than I do in a lot of other places.
Yeah.
Of course, I also said that, and we ended up with a wrestler for a governor, but we don't know, and it is an enigma.
It is. I mean, Ventura's is a whole different discussion that occurred at a time of the politics of a state with 2.2% unemployment and $5 billion in the bank. As one of my friends said, there were 37% of the voters in Minnesota gave the state the middle finger at that point and said, let's experiment. I think Minnesotans have reached a different conclusion 18 years later about whether or not to take chances like that again.
And we can hope, but we will know too soon, actually too late, because after all the political advertising and the money that has been dumped into this campaign, criminal,
right,
that we don't have a 6-week window on elections,
right,
that we don't keep lobbyists from writing really legislation, that we finance our elections through the government so that we don't have this influx of money.
Right.
These are all things that I had hoped to see in my lifetime improve, and I haven't.
We haven't.
And it's disappointing.
It's disappointing. Trump a few weeks ago talked about the election being rigged. He's right, but for the wrong reason. The elections are actually rigged in his favor, when you think about it. Is it the voter suppression that's going on, the gap between the rich and the poor? There are many factors that are actually working in his favor at this point in terms of how the elections are rigged, if I can use that phrase broadly. And I just mention that because, contrary to what he says, he's not at his disadvantage. He's at an enormous advantage, and in many ways, Clinton is the underdog here. Even though she's the establishment politician, she really is the underdog fighting against an entrenched system of sexism, against wealth, against power, against racism, and it's a tough battle.
And on that depressing thought, Professor David Schultz, we'll talk again after the election.
Thank you very much for having me.